has been called perhaps the greatest miracle of the 20th century, the rebirth of the nation Israel. It really, in many ways, was the megaphone to the world that God's word is true, that God is faithful, and all of God's promises to the nation of Israel will indeed come true. As I thought about our time together today with Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff and Randal Neal, I was reminded of a story that took place some 300 years ago, a discussion between Frederick II, King of Prussia, 1740 to 1786, with his highly respected and devout Christian cavalry general, Hans Joachim von Zieten. The king was asking his trusted cavalry general, skeptical of the Bible, skeptical of God. He said to him, he said, give me proof, the truth of the Bible in 2 words. To which von Zieten then said, Your Majesty, the Jews. Their miraculous preservation, even at that point, before they even had acquired their land, spoke to the truthfulness not only of God, but of His Word to von Zieten. Well, this morning, I want to introduce to you a couple of people that I've come to know over the last number of months. As many of you know, I was in Israel in March and had the privilege of being invited by COFI, Christians United for Israel. They pretty much paid for everything, and it was a roller coaster marathon event. When I got back, I was exhausted, but thoroughly enjoyed it, took copious amounts of notes. And as you all know, I shared about that for several Sundays afterwards because it was so exciting. I am still excited about what God is doing. It is really God's megaphone to the world when you see what's going on in Israel, that God is God. The Bible is true, and He will keep His promises to the nation of Israel. So this morning I want to share with you a little bit about our 2 speakers, mostly our main speaker. We're going to dismiss our kids. I'll do this in just a moment. I got that, Patty. I see that hand there. So let me just share with you briefly about our speakers with us this morning. First of all, Elliot is a political and military analyst, one of the world's leading experts in counterterrorism and Middle East conflict. He serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Population in Northern Region of Israel and the Homeland Front Command. He is the author of the IDF, or Israeli Defense Force Handbook. He literally wrote the handbook that all of the soldiers go through. He is also an expert in weapons, tactics, teaches courses in fieldcraft, small unit tactics, counterterrorism, military history, and strategy. So he asked me, how long do you want me to speak? And I said, well, about an hour. He said, John, I could speak for 70 hours. So I thought we'd make it 3 hours. Good. Next, I want to introduce to you Randal Neal, who is the Western Regional Coordinator with COFI, Christians United for Israel. He became the first full-time grassroots organizer in 2006 for COFI. In this position, Randy pioneered the programming procedures that have since been implemented nationally to grow COFI to one of the largest, in fact, the largest, pro-Israel organization in America. In fact, Randy was saying this morning it was about 3 million, now it's about 3.5 or 3.6 million across the United States. Phenomenal amount of growth in an amazing short time. There's a tremendous support for the nation of Israel in America today, despite all the rhetoric we hear. He has over a decade of experience in educating Christians about the biblical mandate to support Israel, the history of Christian anti-Semitism, political activism in the faith community. Randy serves as the Northwest Board of American Israel Public Affairs Committee and is among one of the most sought-after speakers on the topic of Israel and Christian support for the Jewish state. Both men I've had the opportunity to get to know and have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know each one of them. But let me just share with you my heart why I have them here today. It's not simply because I believe that Israel today is the megaphone of God to the world, but there's something more important. And that's why I've invited them to come speak to you. When you're in an argument with somebody, it's not necessarily who's right, always. It's who has the strongest rhetoric, who tends to win the argument. And today, if you watch the media, if you listen to conversations around the nation, around the world, the rhetoric is strong of being anti-Israel. And so oftentimes the argument is won because the rhetoric appears to be so strong, whether it's right or wrong. So I've asked Elliot, as well as Randy, to be here today to help equip us how do you speak against? How do you counter the rhetoric, though it may be strong, yet speak truth and win the argument to change minds and change hearts about God's megaphone to the world, the nation of Israel? So without further ado, we give them a warm welcome this morning.
Thank you, Pastor Denny. Good morning.
Good morning.
We thoroughly enjoyed having your pastor on our trip in March, and I'm excited to hear that he's already got the works going on to bring a number of you back with him again in the future. So I am the Western Regional Coordinator for CUFI. I cover the 13 states that are west of Nebraska. I was hired by Pastor John Hagee in 2006, and we've been running to keep up with it ever since. And I can echo what your pastor just said, and you know, we believe there is a biblical mandate for Christians to stand with Israel. You can't call yourself a Christian, you can't call yourself an observant Jew if you don't love what God loves. Amen?
Amen.
And my Bible makes it pretty clear that God has plans and purposes and a burden and an affinity for Israel and the Jewish people. And I believe absolutely with every fiber in my being that he is using Israel. People ask the question, why did he choose the Jews? What's so important about Israel? I believe that he's using Israel to reveal and glorify himself and send a message to those that try to follow him, that our faith rests in a God that's in the business of keeping his promises. Our faith rests in a covenant-keeping God. And when if you endeavor to open up your Bible from the first book to the last, the absolute least, the absolute worst thing that will happen to you is that you'll come out the other end realizing that your faith rests in a God that is in the business of keeping his promises. And he will perform miracles to do it if he has to. Amen. You know, Genesis 12:3, I'll bless those that bless thee, and I'll curse thee that curse thee, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. He's not a lucky rabbit's foot. You don't give to get. But it's very much like the passage, I think it's a cousin to the passage in Malachi, where he asked you to bring the tithe and to trust him with a little bit of what was already his in the first place. And when you do that, then he'll use that to grow your faith.
Amen.
Psalm 122, you know, may they prosper that love thee. And if you take a look at Ezekiel 36, you'll see miracles that have been performed within the last century and some that are being performed right before our eyes within our lifetime. You know, when we left, I encourage all the 32 pastors that went with Pastor Denny. You know, it's great to stand on a 2,000-year-old sidewalk. And Neil Armstrong strode on that same sidewalk that we did. And when he was done, he said, those are the most important steps I've ever taken.
Wow.
But don't miss what God's doing today. And you can see what he's doing today through the windows of the bus. And just as he's making the desert bloom and the uninhabited cities are thriving again. It's just absolutely miraculous. I believe if you take a look at Acts 10, you can take a look at a Gentile family that had a great reputation among the Jewish family. Cornelius the centurion and his household became, because of their faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their good deeds and support for the Jewish community, God chose that Gentile home to be the tip of that wild olive shoot that Paul talks about in Romans 11, to be grafted in and become co-heirs to the promises and covenants of the Jewish people and that God has given them. Amen. And so through the mercies of Jesus Christ, we've been adopted in as well. Amen. So it's important for us to realize, you know, I want to put up a couple of disclaimers. We're not an interfaith or ecumenical organization. We are an evangelical Christian organization. The speaker that you're going to have today, Elliot, he's an observant Orthodox Jew. He's not a Messianic Jew, so let's not have anybody be distracted. And we just make it, he knows without any question that I don't sugarcoat, I don't dilute, I don't apologize, I make no secret of the fact that I believe Jesus Christ is the Messiah.
Amen.
I don't check that at the door. What sets us apart from other organizations is that I don't demand that my Jewish friends agree with me theologically before I'm going to commit to stand with them unwaveringly.
Amen.
We've got 1,700 years of extremely unchristlike behavior under our banner to the Jewish people. We can't rewrite it, we can't self-loathe about it, but we can commit to change the trend so it doesn't happen again, because believe me, it's taking its mark on the international stage to try to happen again.
Yes, it is.
And so we're going to ask you to endeavor with Psalm 122 and pray. If you don't already pray for the peace of Jerusalem, it's time to start. If you already do, it's time to take it up a notch. but let's get up from our knees and tangibly act as well. So we were founded in 2006 with 412 members. Today we're 3.6 million. One of the most important things that we do is bring pastors to Israel that have never been, so that they can see with their own eyes. Is Israel an apartheid state? Is Israel a racist state? Is Israel a...
Yeah.
And so when you're dealing with that, truth is your weapon and facts are your ammunition. And so it's our hope that today will help you load up. And we're going to ask you to pursue that. One of the second, if not equal, endeavors that we do that I believe is extremely critical is passing that baton to the Joshua generation, and that is CUFI on campus. The first CUFI on campus leader that we had, Derek Ingerman, actually went just a little bit south of here. He was a student at Idaho North University in Coeur d'Alene, and really helped us break the ground. Today, it's one of the most important things that we do, and we bring 500 to 600 college students every single year to Washington, D.C., where they get an intensive immersion in activism and training. The first thing that we teach them is how to guard their faith on a college campus, because when they hit that college campus, their faith is challenged and they're ostracized for it. And so we teach them how to undergird it and how to keep it. And then we teach them how to develop the leadership skills in themselves, how to develop leadership skills in others, and how to bring that to the table and impact and influence the political fabric and process of this country. Because you're called to be salt and light beyond the thresholds of those doors back there, and that includes the political process and the political fabric of this nation. You can't have a knee-jerk reaction if you don't like the way the country's going, if you don't even know the name of your elected official or even bother to register to vote. And I apologize if I just hit a nerve with anybody, but we are called to influence things, and we can't wait. It took one person for abortion to become legal, because millions of Christians thought it was such a horrific idea that plenty of other people would stand up against it, so they didn't. And so we're asking you to, pray like you never have before, but let's get up from our knees and tangibly act and lock arms and join our voices together.
Amen.
I'm going to ask in a moment to tee up a short video clip that'll give you an overview of CUFI on campus. It's barely 4 minutes long, but later in the morning you'll be given the opportunity to sow into this ministry. Every cent that you are able to give will go to CUFI on campus, and Pastor will make a note of what that amount is. Every penny will be earmarked to provide sponsorships for students from preferably this church, at least from this region, to go to our DC Summit to be trained so that they'll come back and they will be ninjas when it comes to political activism, using their Judeo-Christian moral compass in the steps that they take, and they'll have those skills with them for the rest of their lives. Before we do that, I just want to just inject those disclaimers that, again, Elliot is an Orthodox observant Jew, and I don't make a secret about it. I do believe Jesus Christ is the Messiah. We put our tongue in our cheek sometimes, and we joke that when the Messiah comes, we'll ask if it's his first or second visit, and one of us will change it. And some people are afraid of looking at the Jewish roots of the Christian faith, because we've seen others that have wandered way down a pretty slippery slope, and pretty soon they're pretending that they're almost Jewish sometimes. But it's important for us to realize and appreciate and learn about the Jewish roots of our Christian faith. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Mary wasn't a Catholic. John wasn't a Baptist. They were all Jews. And so the more that we learn about that, the more we appreciate it, the better grasp that we can have. So if I could ask Diane to cue up that short clip, and then we'll have our guest speaker come up.
While she's getting that going, you're welcome, kids, to dismiss for Kids Quest. So you're welcome, kids. Go ahead and go to Kids Quest at this time while she's queuing up this video.
I'll let you go ahead and work on that off screen. So we'll circle back around. We'll put a pin in that one, and we'll tee it up when we wrap up before we dismiss. But at this point, I'll bring up our keynote speaker. We came in company with Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff in 2008 when we brought our very first group of leaders and members to Israel. We had 690 people that we brought to Israel in 2008. And we started scouring. Who can we bring that can give a Middle East briefing? Who can we have address this audience that can answer the questions that are not being given to us on CNN or Fox News? Who has the authority, who has the experience, who has the credentials that can really deliver the messages that these people need to know about the realities of Israel's security concerns? And everyone that we asked, so one name kept emerging, and that was Elliot Chodoff. He is one of Israel's premier counterterrorism experts, as your pastor already explained to you a few minutes ago. He is the author. We always try to flatter or compliment somebody with the expression, oh, he wrote the book on that, to kind of underscore their expertise in that field. Elliot literally wrote the Infantry Field Handbook. He is a professor of military history and strategy. If during the time of Q&A you can think of a question that he can't answer, it's probably because it's classified and he'd have to kill you. But when I do Q&A, I preface it with easy and friendly questions. You don't have to do that with him. Just frame it as a question when we get to that time. So be thinking of that as you hear him speak, because there's a lot of things unfolding. What's news on Monday in the Middle East isn't news on Tuesday. And so it's if you've been tracking it, and if you haven't, you will be after you're done this morning. But there are things that are rapidly unfolding in the Middle East, changing the train. So we're about to get briefed. You're about to be informed and inspired and equipped. Please give a really warm Priest River. Let's pause it. We'll run that after Ellie this time. So let's give a real. But now you're curious to see, aren't you? Yeah. So just let's give a really warm Priest River.
If I could have the map, please. That one doesn't move. Actually, it doesn't. Thank you. It's great to be here. I want to do a few things with you this morning. Pastor said I can basically have as much time as I want, so breakfast tomorrow morning is my time. I want to talk a little bit about the map and the land of Israel and go back a little bit, let's say about 4,000 years. But I'm not going to do it year by year. Then talk a bit about what's going on today in this area. Both in terms of what's happened over the past decade or two, and focus a little bit on what's been going on in the past 6 months since the new administration came in, because it's affecting lots of things on the ground. And conclude with, I served in Northern Command of the IDF. The Israeli military is divided on the ground into 4 regional commands, North, Center, and South. For those who are familiar with American military organization, a regional command is the equivalent of an army headquarters. And the northern region where I serve is responsible for the Lebanese and Syrian borders. It's charming, it's interesting. Talk a little bit about that and what all of that means. So let's talk about the map. This isn't the entire Middle East, it's the Asian part of it primarily. There's the North African part that's off this map to the left, but this is good enough for our purposes. Can you see Israel?
Barely.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, Israel's the country that they refer to as expansionist, imperialist, colonialist. We're not very good at it. So yeah, Israel's that country that's so small that its name is out in the Mediterranean because it doesn't fit within its borders. Okay. So that's Israel. Israel's part of a region that's commonly referred to as the Middle East, but I want to just use the map for a moment to focus. The Middle East is a modern term, but it's a critical region and has been a critical region strategically for about 4,000 years. I'm going to sort of interweave what I'm saying in the practical along with the spiritual, so we can understand this is God's land. Obviously, it's got to be the most important area in the world. But from a purely physical point of view, we're talking about the intersection or the gateway to 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And it's also a land bridge between 2 oceans. Less obvious, but if you think about it, The water going out that way, the Mediterranean, is the Atlantic, and the water coming down this way is out into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. So the only other place that's like that in the world is Panama, which is also kind of important. Okay, but it doesn't have the land bridge aspect. There's a lot of talk today about how Israel basically has no right to exist. The Jewish people don't belong there. There's even the UN. You know what UN stands for? Useless nudniks. If you don't understand what a nudnik is a Yiddish term that goes nudnik, nudnik, nudnik. Okay. So the UN claims that the Jewish people never were there, that the Temple Mount is a Muslim holy site, there's no Jewish connection to the land of Israel. And of course, if you buy that argument, Israel has no legitimacy, has no right to be there, and everything it does is wrong. And there's, unfortunately, if the Muslim world says it, and if our enemies say it, so you say, you know what, my enemies can say whatever they want. When the others begin to say it, you have to sort of step back and say, okay, what do I need to know, not just feel, but know, in order to counter it? So I want to spend a few minutes talking about that and what we're doing there, although some of it may be obvious to some of you. I want to start actually with a commentary. There was a great Jewish commentator named Rashi, wrote commentary on the Hebrew Scriptures and on the Talmud. Today, in Jewish religious schools, you cannot study Scripture without Rashi's commentary. He lived about 1,000 years ago. And I want to start with something, I'm going to mention him again a little bit later in my talk, later toward the end, but he wrote a linear commentary. Basically, virtually every verse in Scripture has at least something that he had to say about it. And I want to start with him because he wrote something incredibly important on this subject in his first commentary on the first words of the first verse of the first chapter of the first book of Scripture. And you know what that is? In the beginning, right? Which in Hebrew is one word, Bereshit. And he starts actually by quoting his father. It's very interesting. He never wrote an introduction to his commentary, so you know, I'm sure you've read introductions to books or acknowledgments of, I thank my parents for all they've done for me kind of thing. So his father was a rabbi. He wasn't a renowned rabbi. He starts by quoting him. And he says, my father, he doesn't mention his father, he mentions by name, Rabbi Yitzchak, asked a question. If the Torah is a book of laws, which it is among other things, why doesn't it begin with the first law commanded to the children of Israel? Now, I'm not going to make that a trivia question. The first law that the children of Israel are commanded by God is, this month shall be the first of your months. Chapter 12 of Exodus. That's the first direct commandment that God says to Moses to command the children of Israel. So now I'm going to paraphrase. He doesn't write it this way, but he basically says, look, for Genesis 50 chapters, so 51 chapters before we get to the first law. That's a rather long introduction, even by Jewish standards. What's going on here? Why? Why not? And then he writes something very interesting, and I'm going to remind you, this is a man who's writing in Europe 1,000 years ago. He says the following. The Torah begins with the words, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, so that in the future, when the nations of the world will say to the Jewish people, you are thieves for stealing the land, the answer will be, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. They belong to Him. He divided them among the nations and gave this land to the people of Israel.
Amen.
And when you think about when he's writing it, where he's writing it, and where we are today, you get a kind of a sense of the impact and his understanding of world history backward and forward. So God promises the land to the Jewish people, to the descendants of Abraham. And I'm not going to give you a long biblical commentary here, but I know you know your Bible. Every place in the Torah where the word covenant is elaborated on, it talks about the land. The land is a central part of the covenant. It's not the only part, but it's a central part. And the Jewish people is going to come and go. By the way, it starts with Abraham. Abraham is born outside the land of Israel. He's told to go to the land of Israel. And his grandson Jacob spends a good part of his life outside the land of Israel. The Torah is given outside the land of Israel. But that doesn't, there's something prophetic in here, because it doesn't, what it tells you is that you don't have to be there for it to continue to be yours. Because the promise is the promise. There are two grand exiles and redemptions. A third one, if you will, starts with Abraham. And I want to spend a moment on that before I zoom forward. When God makes his first covenant with Abraham, he tells him, your descendants will be slaves in a foreign land. Please note, it's not a conditional. He doesn't say to Abraham, if your children don't behave, they will be slaves in a foreign land. The slavery in Egypt is process, not punishment. Because you can't have the great glory of the Exodus without slavery. So now let's fast forward to the end of Deuteronomy. You can't have the miracle of the ingathering of the exiles and their reestablishment and rebuilding the land without the scattering, the oppression, and the desolation of the land to begin with. Otherwise, it's not a miracle. So the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel for roughly 1,000 years. Here I say roughly, I'm not an historian. I use history. By the way, you should know, in Israel, what you call history, we call the late modern period. With all due respect, a couple hundred years. So we use thousands as a rounding number. So the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel for about 1,000 years, a little over 1,000 years, from David until the destruction of the Second Temple. Lived a little bit longer, on the other end, but had Commonwealth Kingdom for about 1,000 years. And then Jerusalem was destroyed, and over the next couple of centuries, the Jewish people went into exile. But I want to spend a moment there as well before I move to the more modern history. The destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple for the Jewish people was a tragedy, but not a catastrophe. A tragedy because it was a tragedy, but why not a catastrophe? I want to illustrate it by a story that's told in the Talmud about Rabbi Akiva, a great second century rabbi, sage, and two other rabbis who were visiting the destroyed temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, obviously after the destruction. And while the three of them are walking through the ruins, foxes scurry between the stones. And the other two rabbis break out in tears, and Akiva laughs. And the Talmud relates that they look at each other, and the rabbis say to Akiva, "Why are you laughing?" And he says to them, "Why are you crying?" Good answer. They said, "Isn't it obvious? Here where the temple stood, and in the Holy of Holies where the high priest came every Yom Kippur, every Day of Atonement, to the service, the great service of the Day of Atonement, here everything is in ruins and the foxes are running through the ruins. How can you not cry?" And he said, "You don't get it." And again, I'm paraphrasing, not verbatim. "You don't get it. I'm laughing because in Lamentations, it prophesies, foxes will run through your ruins." So if the prophecy of destruction is true, then the prophecy of redemption is also true. So sometimes you have to know what you're seeing to understand it. Nearly 2,000 years later, after centuries of scattering, oppression, horrific events, the Jewish people decides to return to its land. And I say decides to return to its land because in the narrative of today it talks about no connection between the land of Israel and the Jewish people. Let me tell you three things. From the time of before the destruction, the Jewish people, according to the commandment in the Torah, after every meal says a grace. We say grace after meals. We bless God before, and we say grace after. It's easy to thank God when you're hungry. But after you've eaten, that's a good time to stop and say thank you. And that grace after meals is heavily weighted in thanking him also for the land. In other words, every time a Jew would sit down and eat a meal, he would thank God for the promise of the land. Very interesting. Second, since the destruction, on Passover, at the end of the Passover Seder, and on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, at the end of the Day of Atonement, we say the words, L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim. For the next year in Jerusalem. Not sometime in the future, next year. In other words, not that we should go, next year when I say these words, may it be in Jerusalem. For 2,000 years. And last but not least, Jews pray 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, and the central part of the prayer is a prayer called the Amidah. It's called the standing prayer. You must stand for it. And there's a tradition that you begin the prayer by taking 3 steps back, sort of stepping out of this realm, and then take 3 steps forward. And one way to look at it is you're stepping, sort of facing God. But there's another aspect to it. When Jews pray, no matter where they are in the world, they face Jerusalem. Within the land of Israel, that's generally eastward. Within the land of Israel, we face Jerusalem north, east, or south, in other words, pointing in the direction. In Jerusalem, you face the Temple Mount. And what it means, basically, when you begin your prayer, the first part of your prayer is taking 3 steps toward Jerusalem. By the 19th century, this had become a dream. But in the 19th century, it started to become a physical reality. There are a whole bunch of historical reasons for it. The Jewish people begins to return to the land of Israel, and interestingly enough, it returns to a land that is desolate, and you don't have to take my word for it. Open up Mark Twain, Innocents Abroad. I see people nodding. If you've read the section, what he relates in Innocents Abroad, he visited the land of Israel in the 19th century. If you read the curses of Deuteronomy and read Mark Twain, you're reading the fulfillment of the destruction just as the fox is running through the roads. And if you come to Israel today, you'll see the prophecy of redemption. No matter where you are scattered in the face of the earth, from there I'll gather you. But keep in mind that with that spiritual component, it was a land that was not depopulated. There were people living there, but not a lot. Twain writes about the fact that he travels for hours and doesn't see a single person. Not a lot. The battles begin not when the Jews return, but because the Jews have returned, because others don't want them there. And I'll conclude. Pastor talked about 1948 as the miracle. 1948 was the miracle that butted heads with those who saw the return of the Jewish people to their land as an important step, historical, not just spiritual. A nation that had been scattered was returning to its indigenous homeland, to speak the language that had been spoken there 2,000 years ago, to use the calendar that was used there 2,000 years ago. This isn't a colonial enterprise. The Jews didn't come to the land of Israel and speak German and French and English. They came and resurrected a language that had not been used as a spoken language for nearly 2,000 years. The opposition to that is what created the conflict. And the attempt to throw the Jews out, particularly in 1948, and there's not a lot of debate over this, because all you really need to do to understand what the other side wants to do is listen. When the UN voted to partition Palestine in 1947, Palestine's a whole story in and of itself, maybe in Q&A if you're interested, I'll elaborate on the name. Into a Jewish state and an Arab state, the Jews danced in the streets, and the official Arab response was, we will drown this resolution in Jewish blood. Not a lot of guesswork here. And that is the source of the conflict that we're facing today. And up until this very moment, a rejection on the part of the other side that the Jewish people has either a right or even a history in that land. It's very hard to have discourse with somebody who says, you were never here, when you find ancient Hebrew on coins that you can pick up off the ground, and I found a few myself, just literally on the surface. That's a bit of background. I want to talk about what's going on more currently, and again, starting with this region we call the Middle East, by very briefly saying that the Middle East today doesn't exist. Okay, I mean, it's on the map. I even say Middle East up there on the top, so you know if it's written, it's got to be right. And if it's in Facebook, it has to be right. But as a geopolitical, geostrategic region, it doesn't exist anymore. And that has major impact on all of our lives, whether we feel it immediately. I feel it more immediately than you do. I want to take you just for a quick walk through what I just said and what it means. If I were standing here 20 years ago, talking about the Middle East as a political entity, not a geographical one, I'd be essentially talking about 4 countries. And those countries are Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. First of all, please note I did not say Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not a power. Saudi Arabia is a financier. Okay, and Saudi Arabia has had a problem, it has bought the solution. Bought American, bought European, bought Arab, bought the solution. One of the things that's going on today is that its major supplier of solutions, the United States of America, has gone out of the market. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So those 4 countries, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. Egypt is hanging in there, but Syria, Iraq, and Libya don't exist anymore. They're just not there. Now again, they're on maps. They have flags. They have a UN representative who condemns Israel. If you're really way out there, like Libya and Iran and places like that, you can even send on the Human Rights Council to teach America and Israel how to do human rights stuff. You can't make this stuff up. But as actors, as entities, as countries that have some sort of power to do anything, they're not there. Add to that, Lebanon is not there. There are 2 armies in Lebanon. The second most powerful one is the Lebanese army. Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, is more powerful than the Lebanese army. Yemen doesn't exist anymore. Jordan is hanging in there by the skin of its teeth. Now, it's been doing that for about 70 years, but still, it's not a power, it's not a force. So what's left? Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. That's the Middle East. It's gone. With it being gone, the Arab world is gone. Now, once again, I want to be clear. Not that the Arabs are gone. The Arabs are there. By the way, when I say Arab, anybody know what I mean? Definition of an Arab?
Mongrel.
No.
Descendant of Esau?
No. By the way, there's some really, truly wonderful Arabs, friends of mine, colleagues of mine. No, a native speaker of Arabic is an Arab. In other words, it's an ethnic, cultural definition. The Arab world runs from Morocco to Iraq. By the way, note, Arab and Muslim is not the same thing. There are Arabs who are not Muslim. There are Arab Christians, fewer and fewer all the time, but there are Arab Christians. And there are many, many, many Muslims who are not Arabs. Okay, the country with the largest Muslim population in the world is Indonesia, not Arab. Other important Muslim countries, I'm not talking about countries with Muslim populations, because there are a whole bunch of them, but important Muslim countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, to name a few. Not Arab. So when I talk about the Middle East as the Middle East, leave Iran and Turkey, I'll come back to that. The Arab world as an entity, geopolitical entity, the Arab League has no power because those countries don't exist. Not as real players on the international scene. Why did it happen? I can't give you a definitive answer because nobody really knows. It's too close, it's still going on. But I'll give you a few points, indicators. The Middle East was created 100 years ago. It was created by the British and French in World War I. They divided it up between them. They drew it up. If you look at the map, here is a little less obvious. On the North African side, it's a little more obvious. A lot of straight lines. You can see some of them on this one. You know what straight lines on the maps mean? It means they were sitting somewhere else with rulers. And ignoring geography, topography, resources, and peoples. And And I'm going to mention the peoples in particular because what they did basically was create states with too many nations, and they left nations with no states. The ultimate outcome is chaos. It's not inevitable. In other words, there's no good reason why over 100 years these countries couldn't have consolidated, but they didn't. That's it. Here we are. Over the past decade, one additional factor has sort of brought it to the surface, and that is the withdrawal of the only superpower in the world, that's you guys, the United States of America. About a decade ago, and here I want to be very clear, I have a lot of criticism of the most recent past administration, but a lot of it has to do with it being the most recent past administration. In other words, if we have the time, I can take you back 2 and 3 and beyond with plenty of criticism too. The greatest impact was just the most recent one. But over longer than that, there's been an American withdrawal from the Middle East. About a month ago, an American aircraft carrier docked at Israel's port of Haifa for the first time. It didn't come into the port because the carrier is bigger than the port, but docked just offshore. Visiting Haifa for the first, an American aircraft carrier for the first time in 17 years. Now, why is that? And if you're thinking because America is anti-Israel in the previous 17 years, that's not the answer. The answer is, this is the first time in 17 years that there has been an American aircraft carrier stationed in the Mediterranean. Okay, the 6th Fleet, the American Mediterranean Fleet, up until about the year 2000, had as its centerpiece a carrier task force. That disappeared around the year 2000 and only reappeared this year. Now, if you take an aircraft carrier out of the Mediterranean, what you're basically saying is that this region doesn't really matter that much to me. And that wasn't just in action, it was also in words. America basically withdrew from the Middle East, and I'm not talking about pulling troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's all a different question. The reason given was kind of interesting, shocking to me, because I'm a strategist, and this kind of stuff shocks, at least in the chilling sense of shocking. Middle Eastern oil is no longer important to America, and therefore America doesn't need to be in the Middle East. Now, I'll tell you, oil is not my field, except what I pump into my car. Too much of it. But I'll take it at face value. In other words, I will accept as a statement that Middle Eastern oil is no longer important to the United States. But here I have a problem, and it's an arithmetic problem. If this region has been important for 4,000 years, and oil has been important for 100 years, apparently there's something going on here that transcends the importance of oil. But America pulls out. With that, there's a collapse, and I don't want to draw a direct cause line. America pulls out and there's a collapse, but it's a contributing factor. But on top of that nature, of course, a vacuum. And there are others out there, I call them imperial wannabes, who know the importance of this region, and in the absence of American presence, are moving in. The Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians. And what's happened now is that the Middle East has become an imperial wannabe battleground. I say wannabe because they're not there yet. But they're working towards it. And we know they are because, here again, Putin, Erdogan of Turkey, Khomeini of Iran. I have to tell you, I like those guys. I do. I like the terrorist organizations too. I like Hamas. I like Hezbollah. I like honest murderers. Because they make my job as a strategic analyst so much easier. If you know anything about strategic analysis, you know that it boils down basically to 2 categories: capabilities and intentions. And it's usually much, much easier to assess capabilities than intentions. By the way, America has this problem today with North Korea. America knows what North Korea's capabilities are, but what is that lunatic thinking? A big question mark. I'm not sure he knows either, but that leave it. So you can calculate capabilities. If you have good intel people, and we do, America does, Israel does, you can get a sense of what they're capable of doing. But what do they plan on doing with it? Who knows? With these guys, it's easy. Let me start with the easiest of all. Hamas, the Islamic terrorist organization that rules Gaza and would rule the West Bank if we pulled out. Open their charter, you can do this very safe, you can Google it. Open their charter, what they call the covenant or the charter of Allah, and read the first line. Israel will exist until Islam obliterates it. What do they mean? What are their intentions? Not so difficult. When Iran says Israel needs to be wiped off the map, gee, what are they really thinking?
That we know.
By the way, when they say death to America, what do you think they mean by that? Okay, I'll come back to Iran. But let me tell you this right now. You can write this down as some advice. Always trust your enemy's threats more than your friend's promises.
Amen.
When Putin says that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union, what is he trying to do now? He doesn't want to rebuild the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. When Erdogan of Turkey says the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there you go. And when Khomeini came to power and said he wants to rebuild the Persian Empire, what was he thinking? Well, if you're not sure about that, open the book of Esther. That Persian Empire. Basically global, because the Persian Empire of then was global. Didn't have the entire globe, the world did. So they've moved in, and I'm not going to break them down because I want to focus a little more on Iran, but the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians all understand that if you want to think imperial, not regional, but imperial, you need to control this region because it gives you that bridge between the continents and the bridge between the oceans. And the oceans here are critical, more so at the moment for Russia and Iran than Turkey, because Turkey already sits on the Mediterranean. But the Russians have an Atlantic problem, and the Iranians have an Atlantic problem. The Russians, because their ports, their natural ports, are north of the Arctic Circle, and they need what's known in the strategic literature as warm water ports, where they can go out 12 months a year. Because if America makes a move in the Atlantic in February, the Russians can't say, hey, we'll catch up with you in July. Okay? And the Iranians don't have access to the Mediterranean / the Atlantic. They only have access to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And they need to, for their aspirations, they need to get out there as well. Let's keep in mind that the battle for Europe is fought in the Atlantic Ocean, not on the continent. So they get it. Putin is a chess player, and the Persians invented chess. So we need to pay a little bit of attention to what they're doing. I want to cycle out to Iran. Actually, before I do, all of this is being done, not so much about Israel. Israel catches it for a few reasons. One is because we're in the middle of it, but also because they hate Israel more because of its connection to America than they hate America because of its connection to Israel. Okay, we're seen as America's outpost in the Middle East. Thank you. But America, because of its position, is the target because these people are thinking strategically. And here I just want to give you one quick illustration. I'm going to give away my New York origins. America is in international politics as the Yankees are to baseball. I'm sorry. But think about it. Win often. 27 World Series? I had to say that. Lose sometimes. Always the team to beat, and everybody hates them. That's America. Okay? And secretly want to be them. And maybe that's part of why they hate them. By the way, if you're from New York, you say, good, hate me. Iran is an interesting and special case. Somebody asked Israel's defense minister a number of months ago, what are Israel's 3 greatest threats? He said Iran, Iran, and Iran. And there are a few reasons for that, and I'll give you 2 of the major ones. First of all, Iran, as I mentioned, is interested in global empire. Global empire means it has to clear the region. By the way, your commentators here, and I watch them all the time, will talk about Iran's regional aspirations. Iran is way past regional. Way past regional. And it's been that way from the very beginning. Nobody's been paying attention. Iran's interest is global, and they've been operating that way since day one. Today, they've got a ballistic missile program. And here, let me tell you, you can often tell a country's strategic horizon by the range of their weapons. Okay, I'm not talking about an offshoot single weapon outlier. I'm talking about their weapon systems. All right, America, global superpower, global weapons reach. Let's take Israel for example. A powerful country in its own right, very, very local. Up until a few decades ago, a couple of decades ago, until we perceived Iran as an immediate strategic threat. And by the way, immediate strategic is the key word here because lots of people hate us around the world. We're an immediate strategic threat. Up until that point, we didn't have aircraft, combat aircraft, that could reach Iran. We've got enough problems in close, thank you very much. When Iran became perceived as a threat, we turned to the United States. Two new models were built, the F-15I and the F-16I, which coincidentally can make it to Iran, or not coincidentally. Now, why not buy those in the first place? The answer is very simple. On the average, they cost about 3 times as much. And you don't have to be a great strategist to figure out that it's better to have 3 of what you need than 1 that's twice as good as what you need. So now that raises an interesting question. If Iran is thinking local, why is it building a ballistic missile system that can reach the United States of America? At a huge expense. Although it's a little easier for them today now that they got the $150 billion a couple of years ago from the United States. Thank you for that also. You are now financially the world's greatest state sponsor of terrorism.
That's the truth. Amen.
Hold that thought. Let me tell you a little bit more about them from the terrorist point of view. And the State Department just recently again reaffirmed that Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. But they're more than a sponsor, they're an operator. And I want to take us back to the early 1980s when Khomeini came to power. And in 1981, Iran created what is today the most dangerous, deadly terrorist organization in the world. It's an organization called Hezbollah. Not Al-Qaeda, not ISIS, Hezbollah. They put those other guys in their back pockets. Hezbollah is operating on every continent. They've infiltrated the United States of America in very large numbers. Through the Mexican border, with the help of your friends in Venezuela. You don't have friends in Venezuela. They're not coming here looking for work. Hezbollah is often listed as a proxy of Iran. It is not a proxy, it's an agent. There's an important difference. When a proxy acts, you benefit from it. That's what makes them a proxy. An agent does what you tell them to do. They are an agent of Iran. And if an agent of yours does something in your name, it's your responsibility. Hezbollah brought 2 things to the world in terms of invention, if you will. One is suicide terrorism, and the other is what we call today hybrid warfare. I'm going to leave the hybrid warfare for a moment, suicide terrorism. Yes, Hezbollah, not Al-Qaeda. Significantly, of the first 3 major targets of Hezbollah suicide attacks in the 1980s, of the first 3, 2 were American. Think about that. Subtle message, no? The American embassy in Beirut was blown up by Hezbollah, and the US Marine barracks in Beirut was blown up by Hezbollah, killing 241 Marines. It's the deadliest day in Marine Corps history since the Battle of Iwo Jima. So help me out here, please. Death to America. If blowing up an embassy and a Marine barracks and killing 241 Marines are not acts of war, can somebody in this room please tell me what is an act of war? Iran and America have been at war since 1979, and one side doesn't recognize it, and that side is not Iran.
That's right.
That's why they gave $150 billion. That is what we're facing today, both in terms of nation and its agents. And with that, I want to shift briefly to what we're facing on our northern border, because with all due disrespect to Hamas in Gaza, the real threats to Israel coming from the north. Syria, as I said, descended into chaos. You're familiar with the Syrian war. By my estimate, somewhere between 700,000 and 750,000 dead, millions wounded, millions displaced, millions of refugees, and the UN is condemning Israel for building houses. Makes a lot of sense. That country, the territorial area of that country, because of its chaos, has become the playground not only of those imperial wannabes, but also of terrorist organizations. And along our northern border with Syria, 60-mile-long border with Syria, there are some 60 terrorist organizations operating in what is the most densely packed terrorist organization region in the world. A few of the biggies that you'll recognize: Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda. It's an organization that used to call itself Jabhat al-Nusra. Today they call themselves Fatah Shams. They broke away from Al-Qaeda. They considered Al-Qaeda to be too moderate. Charming people. Another organization that calls themselves Shuhada al-Yarmouk. You know them as ISIS. And some 50 or so smaller organizations, all of which have the words Islamic and Jihad somewhere mixed in, woven into their names. And here I have to tell you, the bigger organizations are actually the easier ones for us to deal with. They behave themselves. Because you can negotiate with terrorists. You just have to know what language to use. I'm an undergraduate of the Vito Corleone School of Negotiating. And you can negotiate. They shoot at you, you kill them, they learn. And don't make the mistake of thinking that you can't threaten a suicide organization. First of all, there's no such thing as a suicide organization. Organizations don't commit suicide. But organizations that use suicide attackers, please note, you don't rise up through the ranks to leadership in a suicide organization. Right? You don't commit suicide a few times, get promoted. There's a very, very clear dividing line between the heroes who send and the heroes who go. And the ones who are sending, please note, bin Laden was not flying a plane on 9/11. Those who are up there can be threatened because they don't have written into their appointment books commit suicide today. So bin Laden wasn't flying a plane on 9/11. There was no bin Laden's last stand in Tora Bora. He had to be tracked down and hiding in Pakistan. So those organizations can be threatened. The smaller ones, which are much more unstable, they're much more local. They're the ones who are jockeying for position much more than the others. And there, unfortunately, in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, one of the ways that you gain market share among that kind of a population is you wake up in the morning and say, let's kill some Jews today. And they make our lives interesting. Okay, enough of the good news. Our border with Lebanon is the real problem, because just north of us in Lebanon is a country that really doesn't exist as a country anymore, that's ruled by the organization Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah has been very involved in Syria as well, and with that there's good news and bad news. The good news is about 1,800 of them have been killed. The bad news is that the organization is gaining an enormous amount of combat experience. And that brings us to the second thing they brought to the world. It's called hybrid warfare. They are terrorists who are trained as military. In other words, we're confronting a terrorist organization that's trained, organized, and equipped as a military organization. So gone are the good old days, if you will, of fighting simply terrorists. Three-man teams who basically didn't know what they were doing. There are about 40,000 Hezbollah terrorists operating in South Lebanon. That's a considerable number. As I said, well-trained, well-equipped, well-organized. And they have in their arsenal something in the neighborhood today of 200,000 rockets. And that's higher than the estimate you're going to read. Trust me on this, I'm right. I'll tell you this, intelligence estimates of quantity of anything will invariably be low because they will not guesstimate what they're missing. So if you read estimate, not just of that, but of anything, always assume the estimate is low because there's stuff that's not in there, not out of classified reasons. I don't pass on classified information. I don't send it by email. But the real world estimate is always going to be a little bit higher. In any event, 200,000 rockets. Let me explain what that means to you, what it means to us, and what it means to you vis-a-vis us. In 2006, we fought a 5-week war with Hezbollah. And in the course of those 5 weeks, and it was inconclusive in the end, and it's a whole story in and of itself, but in the course of those 5 weeks, 4,000 rockets hit northern Israel. Disrupted the lives of over 2 million people, killed a few dozen, wounded a number of dozen more. But they started that war with 20,000 rockets, and in the first few days, the Air Force took out about half of them. And the Air Force, I have to tell you, it pains me to say this as an infantry officer, but the Air Force performed brilliantly during that war. Fair is fair. Today they have 200,000 rockets, in other words, 10 times the number they started with in 2006. More are coming in. There's a myth that they're smuggling weapons into Lebanon. It's simply not true. Smuggling implies clandestine. They're shipping weapons into Lebanon, and Iran is now building them 2 factories, 2 underground factories, to produce their own rockets in Lebanon. Because we've been interdicting a lot of the flow. So they have 10 times as many. They're larger, longer range. They can reach into the Negev. They can reach Dimona in the Negev if you're familiar with the map of Israel. If not, what it means is the only city in Israel that is not in Hezbollah rocket range is the southern city of Eilat at the very, very southern tip of Israel. That's in range of ISIS rockets from Sinai, so everybody's sort of covered. They're more accurate than they were in 2006, and most importantly, they can fire many dozens of them simultaneously at a single target. Okay, I can't tell you the exact number because that is classified, what we know, but many dozens. It's adequate for our purposes. Because what that means is that the Iron Dome interceptor, if you're familiar with it, the rocket interceptor, won't work. Not that its technology won't work, but we won't be able to intercept that many incoming rockets simultaneously. In sports, it's called flooding the zone. Their plan is to fire 2,000 rockets a day into Israel. So I'm going to go back and say 2006, 4,000 over 5 weeks. Now their plan is to fire 2,000 a day. I won't go into the casualty estimates because I don't really believe them. Not because I think that they're too high or too low, but I just think the estimates are too wild. But we're talking about casualties, and we're talking about significant casualties, we're talking about significant damage. And what that means is that Israel will no longer be able to practice what we've preached and practiced for decades. And that is to be the most ethical army in the world. We're moving out of a period that I call luxury war. Now, I need to explain that because luxury and war don't really go well together. So when I say luxury war, I'm not talking about for the people on the ground. There's no luxury. It doesn't matter what the scale of the historical event is. When they're shooting at you, it's you. For the decision makers, there's luxury. And in decision making, by the way, this is true on a personal level as well, not just on a national or international level. The difference between crisis and luxury in decision making comes down to one commodity: time. Okay, think about this. If you have an issue that you have to deal with, and you have time, you have luxury in decision making. Now, it doesn't mean you'll get it right, it doesn't mean you'll succeed, it doesn't mean anything. But decision making luxury means you can think about it, you can get advice, you can get counseling, you can bring resources, you can beg, borrow, steal resources, get them and use them. Take that exact same issue and have to deal with it right now, and it's a crisis. Well, when you have an Iron Dome and a good civil defense system, and rockets are landing at the rate of a half a dozen a time in a target area, you have luxury. If many dozens are hitting a city at once, and they're going to do that day after day after day after day, you don't have luxury. Now, how does that translate into being the most ethical army in the world? The Israeli army is the only army in the world that has a unit made up of soldiers who are fluent speakers of the enemy's language, whose sole mission is to call enemy non-combatants, in other words, enemy civilians, on their cell phones and tell them, in effect, hey, we're going to be attacking your neighborhood tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. You shouldn't be home.
Wow.
Think of what that means in terms of resources. Think of what that means in terms of intelligence capability. And I'll get to the tactical ramifications in a moment. The Israeli Air Force is the only Air Force in the world that has a rule of engagement that states that a pilot or weapons officer may not release a guided weapon unless or until he or she has an alternative target site in an open field, so that if while the weapon is in flight, civilians show up in the target area, it can be diverted and wasted in an open field. If they're already in the target area before the launch, there's no permission to launch. But guided munitions fly very slowly, that's how you can guide them, and the flight time is enough for things to change in an urban area. Consider what both of those mean, and we have others, but use those two as examples, and consider what it means. By telling the enemy what you're going to do tomorrow, you give them plenty of opportunity to prepare for it. Now, if that preparation doesn't pass a certain point, the mission can go anyway, but if it passes a certain point, you're going to call it off, because it's going to fail. That means that whatever that mission needed to accomplish today will not be accomplished today. If you divert a missile from a target, which presumably needed to be destroyed because otherwise you wouldn't have fired a missile at it in the first place, that means that that target isn't going to be destroyed now. Maybe later today, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after that. You can do that in luxury war. You can't do it when 2,000 rockets a day are falling on your cities. So if Israel has been getting bombarded in the press when it's behaving in the most ethical way possible, what's going to happen if we have to end wars quickly? Quickly in military terms means extremely violently. And the damage will be real. Let me give you two examples of that from the press. In 2014, we fought a campaign against Hamas, a mini campaign. And one of the headlines was a classic, Western press. Ceasefire ends as Israeli airstrikes respond to Palestinian rockets. You get that? Ceasefire ends as Israeli airstrikes respond to Palestinian rockets. When they fired the rockets, that was okay. That was within the framework of the ceasefire. Okay, when you have a ceasefire with a terrorist organization, I always call it a shared ceasefire. We cease, they fire. That's all within the frame. Another more recent one. 2 Palestinian youths shot by Israeli police in continuing Jerusalem violence. Oh, did we neglect to mention that they were stabbing people at the time? So, leave it out. It's going to look really bad, because it's going to be very, very difficult. It's a war that cannot go on for 5 weeks. And that brings us to why I'm telling it to you, because even the most pro-Israel administration, and this administration is certainly more pro-Israel than the last one, and I'm not going to comment on alternatives, this is the one it is. But even the most pro-Israel administration is going to find it very difficult to be pro-Israel under a barrage of opposition from the press and from public opinion. And that's where Israel's supporters, not just in the United States, but around the world, but particularly in the United States, come in. Because there are a few things you need to realize. And I'm sure you know some of this, but you have to realize it. I mentioned this before, I'm going to say it again. There is one superpower in the world. It's called the United States of America. America leads and the world follows. You don't have to like it, but get used to it. And America leads not just by dictate, it also leads by action. Let me give you a quick example. In that same campaign in 2014, a decision was made here. The FAA announced that flights to Israel were being canceled. It was suddenly too dangerous. The US carriers, planes in flight were diverted, and they landed in other places. Flights to Israel were canceled. In no time, all the European carriers followed suit. 24 hours later, the FAA lifted the ban, and within a day, all the European carriers were flying to Israel again. You think you don't lead? Think again. So now let me teach you one more thing, and then I conclude. I can teach you a little Torah, right? So, I can teach you a little Torah.
He does.
He does talk. It's his podium. This may cause a surprise to you, but you live in a democratic republic. And the real power in this country is not in an old shaped room in Washington, but it's in rooms like this.
Amen. Amen.
And Randy was courteous. I don't have to be courteous, I'm Israeli. If you didn't vote, you lose your license to complain for 4 years. And if you did vote, that's nice, but if you only use power once every 4 years, it's kind of like going to the gym once every 4 years. So it's good for a couple of days, but then it sort of fades out. If you don't use it, you lose it. And getting involved in an organization like KUFI is certainly a very good way, a very good vehicle of involvement. In addition to that, though, being personally involved is important. Randy mentioned that if you don't know who your elected officials are, you're not exercising your power. If you do know who they are and you're not in touch with them, you're not exercising your power. And let me give you two ideas of this, because we're kind of good at one sometimes and not good at all at the other. If they do something you don't like, let them know. Courteously, but let them know. But as important, and maybe even more important, if they do something you do like, thank them. First of all, it's the right thing to do. I hope that's what you were taught. Thank you. But keep in mind also that if they do something you like, they're probably doing something somebody else doesn't like, and they're letting them know that. So it'd be a good idea to have a little counter pressure coming in the other direction. Let me leave you with this thought. Randy talked about it a bit, and I want to elaborate on it, and certainly in a house of worship. Prayer is important, and I will be the last person to tell you that it's not. But sometimes, it's not only inadequate, but it's also the incorrect response of the moment. And with that, I want to teach you something from the 5 books of Moses. And I know you know the text, so I'll do it in paraphrase. I'm not really good at chapter and verse in English anyway. I'll do this in Hebrew, is that okay? I'll translate what I do. So you know that Moses appears in 4 of the 5 books, right? He's not in Genesis, he's in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you know the text, I see heads nodding, I'm sure you know the text. So you know, first of all, that God and Moses have a very good relationship. I always had this sense that they kind of meet for coffee every morning and they go over the agenda. But they talk all the time. They argue. By the way, arguing is a sign of a good relationship. Seriously. Absence of conflict, this is sociology teaches. Absence of conflict is apathy. How you deal with conflict is the nature of the relationship. But if you don't have any, it means you don't care about anything. Okay? So they have conflict and they argue, and God wins most of them, and Moses wins some of them, right? It's also part of the relationship. It's a relationship. But one thing is clear throughout the text, and that is that they both respect each other. And that, if you think about it a moment, wait a minute. All right, that Moses respects God, of course. But God also speaks with great respect to Moses, even when they're arguing. Even when you get the sense in the undercurrent that God's getting a little fed up with him. It starts in the job interview, in the burning bush. That's what it was, wasn't it? Step into my office, take off your shoes. I've got a job for you. I don't want it. I didn't ask you. I'm not qualified. I'm the judge. I can't speak. I gave you a brother. Go. Yeah. Exactly. And you would think, even there, that God would say, just listen. And he doesn't. He respectfully answers each of his points and sends him on his way. But there's one place in the Torah where God verbally backhand slaps Moses. I want to set it up for you. You know the story of the Exodus, Sisson beat the mill? Plagues, fire, smoke, and they're out. And a week later, they're on the shores of the Red Sea. And Pharaoh has a change of heart. He does a lot of that in that book. And he says, okay, we're going to go after them. And he overloads his chariots. By the way, the Hebrew is interesting there. It says, the word that's used in the Hebrew is shalishim, which comes from the word shalosh, which means three. In other words, the Egyptian chariot normally had 2 men on it. These were manned with 3 men. Okay, so they're overloaded chariots because he wants to make sure he gets the job done. And here these people who were slaves a week ago turn and they see the Egyptian army coming out. And they panic. And they say, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that he brought us out here to die in the desert? Now I'm going to tell you it's not in the text, but I guarantee you, this is where Moses says to God, I told you I didn't want this job. But instead he turns to the people and he says, look upon the Egyptians. As you see them today, you will never see them again. You are about to see the glory of God. Adonai lachem lachem va'atem tacharishun. God will fight for you, and you will be silent. Now there's faith, right? That's when God slaps us. The next verse is commonly mistranslated in English. Not terribly, but nuanced, because it's so harsh in the Hebrew that the translators have a hard time translating it. Hard time emotionally. The one that I like best, meaning the furthest off, goes something like God says to Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Except that's not what the Hebrew says. In the Hebrew it says, God says to Moses, what are you yelling at me for? Literally. I mean, what you would say to a child. Was pulling on your leg. Speak to the children of Israel. Tell them to move. And Rashi, the commentator I mentioned earlier, who wrote that commentary on the land of Israel, jumps on this because this is so out of character. It's so out of place. This is what's going on here. And he says, God is essentially saying to Moses, my people are in danger. Now is not the time for prayer. Now is the time for action. And I'll add parenthetically, you'll have plenty of time to pray later on. So they move. And then an interesting thing happens. And here Cecil gets it wrong. Cecil didn't know. A few verses down it says, the children of Israel walked in the midst of the sea on dry land. In order for the sea to split, they had to march into the water.
Yes.
You want a miracle to happen? You don't stop at the shore and say, okay, here I am. Go for it. If you're not willing to get your feet wet, it's not going to happen. And the Jewish commentaries, the Midrash, say that Nachshon ben Aminadav, who was the first one to go into the water, actually had to progress until the water was above his mouth and his nose. In other words, he would drown as a result, and that's what made the sea split. So prayer is important, but if you want a miracle to happen, you have to be getting up and marching into the water and not standing aside and saying God's going to do it for me. Israel's, and I might add, America's enemies are marching. Sitting is inadequate. Standing isn't good enough. Now is the time that everybody who's in on this needs to get up and march. I'm going to conclude here. I'll save you the breakfast order. There's time for Q&A. Yes? Questions?
Yeah, we're going to do the clip.
Well, okay, we're going to do the clip that didn't run before that. That's why I'm low tech. But anyway, thanks for having me, and God bless you.
Diane cues up the short clip. I just want to just stress that again, one of the most important things that we do is pass that baton to the Joshua generation. And anti-Semitism is alive and well, and it is thriving on our college campuses. It's not just tolerated, it's fashionable. It's chic on our college campuses. It's no longer veiled with a fig leaf of being anti-Zionist. It is blatant anti-Semitism. And so again, any gift that you're able to give will go in its entirety to sponsor students, ideally from this church, or at least from this area. But we can't award those scholarships if nobody nominates a student to receive them. So the ball is really in your court. Give as generously as you can, but help us identify that young man or woman, responsible, reliable beyond their years, that deserve to be invested in. Everything that Elliot tried to convey to you, everything that I hope to convey to you, everything that you will glean from looking at our website or the resources on the table distills down to this one short antidote. The first year that we went to DC, we were expecting 150 or 200 people, stepped out in faith and prepared for 1,500 people. 3,600 people showed up.
Oh, wow.
And the second year, our elected officials thought that we won't come back because groups never come back. And 4,000 people showed up. The third year, they were hoping we wouldn't come back. And 4,500 people showed up, and it kept going on like this. But the first year, we learned a valuable lesson. The mainstream media is not out to cast Christians in a very positive light. They are out to cast Christians as a caricature of ourselves. And so we gave them rules. You can't go here without credentials. You can't go there without a staffer. And I walk into a sea of people in a huge lobby. I see a mic boom with a furry, mic windshield on it. I get up closer, I see a big shoulder camera. I get up closer, the person doing the interview does not have credentials, they don't have a staff. And I'm about ready to intervene, and the hair on the back of my neck is standing up because they're probably looking for a gotcha moment. And as I approach, this person is interviewing a frail white-haired lady with a number tattooed on her left forearm. She was wearing a short sleeve shirt so that people could see the tattoo. It's not very common, so they often don't do that. And with all of the disrespect that you can weave into your voice inflection, the person doing the interview to this woman says, "How does it make you feel to know that after all you survived and endured, you do realize that with Iran on the rise, your kids and grandkids are probably going to face the same thing?" And she didn't miss a beat. She said, "It's not the same thing. We were alone that time. And we're not alone this time." Everything that we're trying to convey to you comes down to that. And if you can lock arms with that, if you can join your voice with that, we want to be a resource. We want to be a tool in your toolbox and an arrow in your quiver. So Diane, if you could run that clip, then we'll shift gears back to Q&A in just a moment. Oh, okay, all right. All right, the clip is not working, so suffice it to say that there's a movement right now. It's called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions. Boycott any products made in Israel. Divest from your investment portfolio with any companies that do business with Israel. Pressure your elected officials to bring war crime sanctions against Israel because they have the audacity to defend themselves when they're being attacked. And the backbone of that infrastructure is on our college campuses, the Muslim Student Association. We're not out to mute them, not out to shut them down. We're simply out to level the playing field so that Israel's fairly and accurately portrayed. The Muslim Student Association started in 1967. Today they have about 300 chapters on campuses across this country. We started in 2008. Today we have 200 chapters across this country and a presence on 300 more. It's very relevant, real tangible work, and that's really your gift. So back, think of a question, try to frame it as a question, and nothing's off the table.
Okay. Yes.
Do you think it will think war will be Psalm 83?
I don't know.
Repeat the question.
Do I think that Israel will see war as Psalm 83? Was that the...
Do you think their next war will be Psalm 83?
Okay. Do I think the next war will be Psalm 83? I can't answer it, and I'll tell you why. First of all, I don't do prophecy. I'm a follower of two great political philosophers, Winston Churchill and Yogi Berra. They both said it's best to prophesy about things that have already happened. Okay? But joking aside, look, I believe we're in miraculous times. I believe we're seeing the fulfillment of a promise. You can look it up, Deuteronomy. Having said that, I also believe the important instruction of the verse in Psalms 90, if I'm not mistaken, that, I'm going to have to translate it from Hebrew, that a day, 1,000 years in your eyes is like a day of yesterday. In other words, we may be in the last day and still 1,000 years away. And that's why I personally find it, for myself, problematic to see an event and say, looking forward, this is what it's fulfilling. It's a lot easier to look backwards and say, I can see that pattern behind me. Personally, I don't presume to tell him how to do things. I watch and I go with the flow. Yes?
Would you comment also, do you have any comment on Ezekiel 38, 39?
You know what, I'm sorry to short circuit questions. I'm not going to do that kind of biblical commentary from here.
Okay, one more. Someone said that Jared Kushner is not a good Jew, not a good Israeli. His father was part of a group, a Hebrew sect that turned away from true Judaism. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, first of all, Jared Kushner is not an Israeli. He is a Jew. And Israel is a nation, and an Israeli is one who has citizenship in the state of Israel, and that includes Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others. It's not for me or for any commenter, I think, to define who's a good Jew and who isn't a bad Jew. I personally think that Jew is something that is an is. There are good people and bad people. I can tell you a lot about that. But I don't think it comes in gradations in that way.
Since you're talking on the northern border, how much trouble have you had with the ISIS troops?
We haven't, okay, the question is the northern border, how much trouble we had with the ISIS troops. We haven't had a huge amount. They launched an attack against us about a year ago. We responded. There are a few less of them now, and they basically learned to behave themselves.
Are you taking rockets from them?
Okay, so good. Are we taking rockets from them? We're not taking rockets specifically from them. I should mention this, and I'm going to take that question to add something to my remarks. Look, we're seeing a very serious change in behavior worldwide, not just in the Middle East, over the past 6 months. And I wanted to spend a couple of minutes explaining what that means, but really only a couple of minutes. Up until this new administration, we come off 8 years of appeasement. And by the way, that's not me, that's Alan Dershowitz. But I don't mind quoting him. Appeasement has two characteristics to it. One that everybody, I think, is familiar with, and that is basically not standing up to your adversary and letting them move forward. But Churchill, who knew something about appeasement, defined appeasement as feeding your friends to the crocodiles, hoping they eat you last. And by the way, if you have a lot of friends, it's not such a bad policy. But eventually you run out of friends. And the crocodiles are still hungry. And then you don't have any friends anymore. If you change a policy of appeasement, in other words, if you shift, and that's, it looks like, and I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to predict, in order for a policy shift to be real, it's got to go the whole way. So up until now, it looks that way, and I'll say cautiously optimistic as far as that goes. When you change away from a policy of appeasement, you essentially tell the crocodiles, feeding time is over, cafe's closed. And at that point, what you have is a bunch of nasty, hungry crocodiles. So what the immediate result of it is not the creation of trouble or of evil, it's rising to its surface. In other words, the Trump administration didn't create the North Korean problem. Okay, it didn't create the Iranian one, it didn't create the Russian one. But the policies are forcing, and the terrorist one, are forcing it to the surface because, and again, this is a very superficial approach to it, but it's the best one I can do in short notice, or in short time frame. Essentially, the other side perceives the closing of a window of opportunity. And if the window is starting to close, that's when you pick up your pace, because you try to get done as much as you can. North Korea, I think, is the best example, or the most obvious one, if not the best. So we're seeing that with the terrorist organizations. The recent events in Israel around Jerusalem are also in part because, I think in large part, because the Palestinian Authority sees that it no longer has a sympathetic administration in the White House. So it had to play by the rules before, now it feels that it doesn't have to, or maybe best off not playing by the rules. And likewise with terrorist organizations, not only along our border, but around. So we're seeing more fire into Israel, but it's couched as accidental fire.
Oh, sure.
So, but what does that mean? It's not accurate. I mean, it really is a kind of lob, and I'm not excusing it, I'm just trying to sort of mark its level. We respond to it, but we don't respond to it at the same level as we would if it were directed, intense, targeted fire. So we're seeing that on the edge, less from ISIS and more from smaller organizations.
And let's talk about rules of engagement.
Let me get some other people a chance.
All right.
Okay. Hold the question back here.
I think you were kind of started answering it there. Maybe I didn't understand it totally, but what's the single biggest reason that the enemies of Israel don't just wipe them out and take over Israel? They're waiting for some of these other factors like China and the United States to kind of come to a head, so the United States is focused on other things than them.
Okay, so the question, why don't the enemies of Israel wipe Israel out? What are they waiting for? Waiting for other things to happen. So okay, there are a whole bunch of answers to your question. Starting with, let him try. Okay, I have to tell you this. In the Passover Haggadah, which was written a couple of thousand years ago, we say every year we say a phrase that in every generation they rise up to annihilate us, and the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hand. And that was written after the Holocaust. It was written 2,000 years in every generation. So you know what? Newsflash, they hate us. Having said that, we don't rely. Okay, we don't believe in miracles. We are a miracle. But at the same time, we don't rely on it. We have a very strong military, very well trained, very highly motivated, with a population that's part of it. For those who don't know, Israel does not have a draft. We have universal conscription. And that stands as a shield against our enemies. On top of that, they're not unified. Thank God. They're busy fighting each other. All of those together are the answer. Not only why they don't win is because of us, why they don't try is because of them. Yes?
I understand that the wall that the Israelis have put up is to defend part of the border is state of the art. But I've also heard or read somewhere that there are tunnels that are being underneath and they're snatching teenagers out of Israel.
Okay. So let me, you saw I've shaken my head different ways. Okay. So let me paraphrase it first. I'll come as close to quoting as possible. A wall along Israel's border, the most sophisticated in the world. There are tunnels under it, and they're snatching Israeli teenagers. So let me clarify all of that. One, first of all, what we call the barrier is about 96-97% fence. It's not a wall. And its purpose is to prevent infiltration, because we got tired of them blowing up our buses and our cafes and our supermarkets. I don't know why, they're just that sort of thing. And one way to make it more difficult for them is to put up a physical barrier to prevent it. Let's also keep in mind that massive, huge expansionist Israel is about the size of New Jersey, and its populated area is about the size of Rhode Island, and at its widest point it's a little over 50 miles wide, which means that you cannot be anywhere in Israel and 30 miles from the border. Okay, so what I said about time, it's with all improper comparison, somebody who gets into the United States and the Mexican border has a long way to go. In Israel, it's walking distance, literally walking distance. So the barrier is up for that purpose. However, anybody who thinks that by putting up some sort of an obstacle, it's going to be the end of the story. You know, you put up a barrier, the terrorists on the other side don't say, oh, there's a barrier. Maybe I should go back to school and become an accountant. They continue to be terrorists. They can continue to test it. And here I'll tell you a very important rule that I teach in the military. And that is that fixed obstacles in and of themselves are not effective. In other words, what makes our barrier effective, with all due respect to the technology, and I navigate with the sun, the moon, and the stars. But with all due respect to the technology, the only thing that will stop a determined human being is a more determined human being on the other side.
You remember that?
The barrier gives them a certain edge, and that edge is what I was talking about before. It gives them a little more time to deal with it. So they're tunneling under it, and we know they're tunneling under it, and there's no technology yet to find tunnels, so we have to come up with other responses. I'm going to stop that part of the answer there. They're snatching people, they're not snatching people. There are a couple of Israelis who went into Gaza on their own, we're not sure why, who were grabbed, but they would dearly love to snatch people. But the 3 teenagers who were kidnapped, that started the operation against Hamas in 2014, were grabbed from they were hitchhiking. And they got into a car that they thought was safe, and it turned out to be lethally unsafe. And that's not blaming them, it shouldn't be that way, but it had nothing to do with tunnels.
Where do you see China in this picture?
Where do I see China in this picture? China's not there yet. And it's an interesting not there yet because China traditionally has been an Asian regional power and not a global power. That doesn't mean they won't become one, but they still have, I'll put it this way, they've always been a global trading power. Now, you could argue, and maybe this is the Chinese idea, conquer the world through trade, not through military. It's nicer, it's safer, and it's just as effective. And that may be, that could be their way of thinking. You know, the great Chinese work on strategy, was written by Chinese strategist 2,500 years ago, Sun Tzu. We generally call it the art of war, the principles of the art of war. Sun Tzu's book is actually a book of principles of how to avoid war and win otherwise. And he actually writes that the greatest victory is the one that doesn't require a battle. So maybe that's what we're seeing. At this point, I don't see China militarily making global moves of any great consequence. Yeah. You're up.
When you were talking about France and Britain drawing lines on the map, you had an interesting statement. You said states that have too many nations and nations that don't have a state.
Right.
Do you have any observations about the trajectory of America, the relation of the state and the nation of USA?
Wow. I don't have a projection because, again, I don't do prophecy. I'm concerned with what I see in America today because of the polarization, and I don't think I need to say a lot on it. It's beyond political polarization. I see a cultural value, ideological polarization, and what concerns me most about it, in case it's not obvious, I can give an entire lecture on this. I'm not going to. What concerns me most about it is that Americans aren't listening to each other. And by the way, in case it's not obvious, I was born in the United States. I grew up in the United States. I've been living in Israel since 1983. So I watch America as an American sort of looking in from the outside, which gives you a different kind of perspective. But I grew up in America, and America's value was, I disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. And now it's, I disagree with what you say, and I'll kill you if you try to say it. That concerns me. Much more than whether the pendulum swings a little bit this way or a little bit that way. Yes?
I understand that you have universal conscription and all young people are asked to serve. Are there conditions that would prevent someone from service? And how do you create a cohesive military when they're forced to serve?
Excellent questions. You triggered the military sociologist in me. That's what I studied at the University of Chicago. So first of all, everybody is required to register. In other words, at age 16, register doesn't mean register draft, register at the induction center. There are essentially two categories of exemption. One is, I'll call it demographic. Arabs are not obligated to serve in the military. They can volunteer, and some do, many do. Not huge numbers, but not tiny numbers either. If they volunteer to serve, once you volunteer, you're under the same laws as everybody else. And the rules, regulations accordingly, in other words, just to put it in simple terms, I have Arab Muslim colleagues who are officers in the military, in the Israeli military. Okay? To take it to what you might think is an extreme. There are categorical exemptions. So, for example, full-time rabbinical students are exempt from service. They have to bring a document showing they're full-time rabbinical students. Leave the historical reasons for that. And of course, there are the personal reasons, health, mental and physical, that will also get an exemption, although here we're kind of strict. Because it's a universal conscription system, we can usually find a job for someone if they can function in some way within society. Okay? Not everybody has to be out there on the front lines. So that's as far as that goes. You're forced to serve, but it's a societal drive. The overwhelming majority do it not because they're forced. They do it because they want to, because it's a rite of passage, because their fathers and their brothers and their neighbors and everybody does it. And it's spoken about in those terms. It's not whether you're going to serve, it's where you're going to serve. And where means at what level. Our special forces are super oversubscribed. I can tell you, when my son went into the military quite a number of years back, he went into what we call a volunteer unit. In other words, a unit that you're going to be selected for. And it was a new company, was recruited. Can't tell you the number, but obviously company scale unit. And the company commander, all of our officers are up through the ranks, so our captains are 23, 24 years old. So the old man got up in front of the 18-year-olds, and they were sitting in an auditorium. And he said, before I begin my talk, I want everyone to look down at the chair you're sitting on and know that there are 7 people who want to be sitting where you're sitting. So anybody who doesn't want to be here, the door is right over there, and we've got them lined up to take your place. You think anybody got it? So that's part of it. Now let me take some from this side. Yes.
I want to know, when I was hearing about Israeli terrorists attacking, I want to know, are they allowed to carry weapons to protect themselves? And if not, why not?
Okay, so the answer is yes, but. We have very, very strict gun control in Israel. For us, I won't go into the details just for time reasons, but it's very, very strict. Those of us who are licensed to carry are licensed and vetted. And what that means is there is an armed population. I'll give you just a simple example of it in a second, what it means. But we don't have everybody walking around with weapons. You probably remember the truck attack in Nice. Was it a year or so ago? And dozens were killed over the amount of time that this guy went back and forth and killed people. Well, a little under a year ago, there was a truck attack in Jerusalem. A group of soldiers who were on a tour. In other words, it wasn't a combat unit deployed. They were getting off a bus as tourists. And a truck went up on the sidewalk and plowed through them, killed 4 soldiers. 19 seconds later, that driver was dead. Because a tour guide, not of that group, but of a group that was standing there touring, a tour guide, who was also a lieutenant colonel in the Army and the reserves, ran down. Now, this is his interview afterwards. You don't know. I mean, a truck goes up on a sidewalk, you don't know that it's a terrorist attack. People lose control of cars. People have heart attacks, God forbid, whatever. So he ran toward the truck to see what was going on, not necessarily thinking terrorist attack, until he got near the truck. He saw the driver, and the driver was shifting into reverse to make another pass, at which point he stood in front of the truck and emptied all 15 rounds from his 9mm pistol into the driver, and that was the end of it. But from the time the soldiers were hit until it was over was 19 seconds.
Perfect.
Okay? I think that answers your question. Yes?
Can you comment, you said, on the name Palestine?
Yes, the name Palestine. So let's go back, and here I'm going to do history, not Bible. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70, after the destruction of Jerusalem, they minted a coin, which they minted a series over about 25 years, bronze, that on the obverse, for those who are not familiar with coinage terminology, on the face, the heads, were profiles of Vespasian, Titus, or Domitian. Vespasian was the emperor at the time of the destruction. Titus, of course, his son, who was the general who destroyed Jerusalem, later became emperor, and Domitian, who was Titus's brother, who became Caesar after him. So during those 3 generations of Caesar, there was this coin. On the flip side, a number of different pictures, but around the rim were the words Judea Capta. Judea has been captured. Now, I mention that because that's not Zionism, and that's not Judaism, and it's not Bible, it's Rome.
Yeah.
Okay, Rome refers to the land as Judea. And if you're not clear where that comes from, Judea from Judah, the tribe of the kings of Israel, the Davidic dynasty. A little over 60 years later, there were a few revolts along the way, but a major revolt breaks out. It was actually the greatest revolt in Roman imperial history, led by a man named Bar Kokhba. And the emperor at the time, the Roman emperor, was Hadrian, who the Jewish sources refer to as the bone crusher, or the bone grinder. He wasn't a nice guy. When the Bar Kokhba rebellion ended in 135, Hadrian renamed the land of Israel, or Judea, and he called it Syria Palestina. Syria to the north and Palestina after the Philistines to the south, in order to erase the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. It would be as if after World War II, the Allies had renamed Germany French Poland. Or Polish France, if you like a better deal. The name Palestina was used commonly for about 200 years. And then in the 4th century, Rome became Christian under Constantine. And while the name still appears in documents, the common usage changed And the land was no longer referred to as Palestina in common discourse, but rather Terra Sancta, the Holy Land. And that's essentially how it's called from the 4th century until the 17th, 18th century, when during the secular Enlightenment in Europe, they don't like the term Terra Sancta because it's too religious, and they revert to the last name that it was used before that, Palestine or Palestina. European maps up into the 20th century have both. In some cases, one on one, one on the other. And in some cases, I'm a map collector. And one of the maps that I have says, Palestine or Terra Sancta. Okay? So in other words, common use. But that's the secular name that the European powers used for it into the 20th century, and hence the name Palestine. Having said that, in the Jews, the Zionists, who are pushing for a homeland in the land of Israel, aren't going to get hung up on semantics in the early 20th century. You want to call it Palestine? Call it Palestine. In Hebrew, they refer to it as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. So you see texts with this translation next to it. In the English, it'll say Palestine. In the Hebrew, it says land of Israel. Now let's fast forward. The Arab population of that area refers to themselves as Arabs. The Jewish population, I'm talking about the 1920s and 1930s, refers to themselves as Palestinians. Because they're connected to the British, and the British refer to it as Palestine. In 1948, you're going to have to listen closely to this, it's a little confusing. The Palestinians become the Israelis, and the Arabs become the Palestinians. It's always confusing. But they really take on a separate identity, a truly separate identity, in the late 1950s, when they realize that the Arab world is not going to rescue them. Because the Arab world really doesn't care about them. And you see the first real movements under the name Palestine in the 1950s, late 1950s. Fatah, Arafat's organization, the Arabic name, Harakat al-Tahrir al-Watani al-Falastini, is the Palestine National Liberation Movement. That's one of the earliest examples of the name Palestine, Palestinian, being used in a national sense by the Arabs. So that's why I say the terminology is problematic. I want to be very clear on this though. If there's Palestinian people and they declare themselves to be one, far be it from me to deny their identity. But let's get our history straight. Big difference. Yes?
What citizens of Israel think about the deep state?
I'm not hearing you, sorry.
What citizens of Israel think about the deep state, the mainstream media, and the New World Order globalists, their agenda?
I didn't get what you said before, the mainstream media.
Deep state. That's
Deep state.
Deep state. Look, we don't have a deep state, but luckily we have a shallow one. Israel's very, very different. I don't want to be facetious. Israel's very, very different from the United States, in part because of its size. Like we're talking about 8 million population, tiny geographical area. And in part because of that universal conscription and reserve duty. I didn't mention, when you get out of the regular army, you go into the reserves. And there is no status retired in the Israeli military. Now that doesn't mean they continue to call you in perpetuity. They still call me, but you serve until they don't want you anymore. And I keep trying to irritate them, but it doesn't work. But what that means, vis-a-vis deep state, is that many of us who are not officially part of the system become officially part of the system for part of the year. And that means that the divide that you have in the United States between the system and the population is much, much, I'll call it less sharp, less stark than it is here. So part of it is size and part of it is that sort of permeability between the insiders and the outsiders. The media. Well, where shall I begin? I don't call it fake news, I call it lies.
Better.
We're way past the spin period, but But I'll tell you, the two worst things that I see in what I call the CNN phenomenon, and here I want to be clear when I say the CNN phenomenon, I don't mean the station. I mean the whole fast food news business that they pioneered, where CNN stands for certainly not news. Okay? No context, no history. No context means if I'm even telling you the truth, it has no founding or framework within which to understand the truth. Do I have a moment to? Brief. Okay. So I'm going to do this quickly. Normally I do this as an exercise. I'll do it simply as a quick presentation. If I were a prosecutor presenting a grand jury case to you as a grand jury, and I told you that we have a homicide, that a man was surrounded by a group of people who with premeditation, one of them rendered him unconscious, and the other one slashed him open, cut out his heart, and killed him, that's a crime. But if I add to that it took place in an operating room in a university hospital, suddenly the context changes everything. The facts are exactly as I presented them. That's without lying. Okay? So no context. No history. In other words, there's no, how did we get from there to here? Because that matters too. And check this out, you can do this yourselves. Pick up a newspaper, pay attention to the news reports, and you'll see that all the verbs used are in the present and future tense. There is no past. If you're lucky, there's a present, but mostly it's a future. They're in the prophecy business, they're not very good at it. Okay, and the most recent example of it that I can think of was the Comey testimony, where all the headlines were saying, this is what Comey is going to say tomorrow in his testimony. Really? That's news? And they were all wrong, because guess what? He didn't get the memo. So we see that time and time again. I gave you a couple of examples before. It's horrendous, and that's a problem, because an informed citizenry is critical to a democracy. A misinformed one is a disaster. And a disinformed one is even worse. New World Order, global, I have to tell you from an Israeli point of view, we have so many problems up close. We don't deal with that level of stuff. Once we're finished with Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and Fatah and Hamas and those guys, we'll start looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. It really, for us, it really is up close and personal.
Who do we listen to for good news?
Who do we listen to for good news? I wish I had a good answer for that. I wish I did. I'll tell you honestly, a year ago, I would have told you, read a whole bunch of them and at least distill the facts. And this is what I used to do. You know, the basic journalism W's, who, what, when, where. Not why, because they don't know that, but at least who, what, when, where. I despair because I can't do that today anymore. I can't even rely on what should be the basic facts of the story. And I'm talking about, this is over the past less than a year, that has gone really to the point where I'm reading and discounting. I have no basis. I'm fortunate because I have inside sources, and I know which random story happens to be true. But I don't have a good source. I wish I did. Yes?
A bit of a personal question here.
Go.
What brought you to Priest River, Idaho today? And what is your goal for these people to take home? What is your point? Is it professional or personal or both?
Great last question.
What?
Great last question.
Great last question. Thank you. Did you set that one up? What brought me to Priest River, and what is my goal and what is my message? So what brought me to Israel, what brought me to Priest River, excuse me, is Kufai. Randy Neal set up the program that I'm on, and we've been on a bit of a run around the West. And of course, our connection with the pastor, Pastor John. Two things. One is to educate and to try to give some context, and I should mention with this, I should have said at the beginning, but better late than never. It was emphasized, I'm a major in the reserves. As a reservist, when I'm dressed like this, I can say whatever I want, and it's me, my responsibility. When I'm in uniform, I'm supposed to say what they want. I usually don't, but court martial me if they want to. But I don't represent the military, I don't represent the country. I'm not a member of a political party. I wouldn't join a party that would have me as a member. My views. So part is to educate in what I see, and you don't have to agree with it. You can look up any of the facts that I throw at you. The analysis is mine. And the second, if you buy it, call you to action. Because the fact is that, as I said before, and I'll repeat, we are all threatened. We're threatened with different proximity, if not different intensity, because I believe that when it happens in this country, and it's not a question of if, 9/11 is going to look like a sideshow.
That's right.
And it's going to be a surprise. The less surprised we all are, the better off we'll all be. And the more prepared, and this isn't a survivalist prepared I'm talking about. That's your business. But the more prepared the country and the system is, the more aware it is, the better off we'll all be. So that's my goal, my objective in being here. So with that, thanks for having me.
Breakfast will be served in 5 minutes. We went a little longer today because I want to give Elliot as much time as we possibly could. Thank you for your enduring patience, and I hope that it was well worth your while this morning and now this afternoon. But as we close our time, I want to remind you of two things that Randy shared with you, that there is an opportunity for you to take action through your giving. Your giving will be used to support students, to be informed, to go to campuses, to know how to advance the truth versus the rhetoric that's being spread on campuses that's anti-Israel. So as you leave from here today, there are two tables. There's one upstairs and there's one downstairs. There are a number of pieces of literature up there, Israel 101, the torch, all these are free. You're welcome to take as many as you'd like or you can use. Also, there are some sign-up forms there that you can make a pledge to CUFI that will help the students. And Randy can explain that briefly as we close our time here. Maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing that one more time, Randy. But if you'd like to give, I want to encourage you to do that. There are baskets on the table upstairs and downstairs if you'd like to give toward that as well this morning. So that literature is there for you. And I hope this gives you an informed introduction to CUFI, Christians United for Israel, and I hope that you become a partner with them in standing with Israel as Americans. So with that, Randy, will you come and share one more time with us and bring us to a close, and I'll pray our time close.
Yeah, up. Back on. Okay. In our circles, when we hear the word pledge, we think that means that we're going to, sign up for X dollars a month. That's not what this pledge is. This pledge simply means that you agree that Israel is a sovereign state that deserves to be able to live in safety and security. And what you're pledging to is you're joining our Rapid Response Action Alert Team. When there's a piece of critical legislation pending, or when you need to weigh in on something, we do most of our mobilizing through emails, and it just means that when you receive an email that says, freshman Senator Rand Paul thinks that we should cut off all the funding that we give Israel, then you be part of the 35,000 folks that clog his inbox and remind him, that we had 7 years left on that financial aid pledge, and just weigh in on it. Folks like us, we don't realize that when you send an email, your elected official thinks that represents about 1,000 other people that feel the same way, but didn't take 3 minutes to let them know. So that's what you're pledging to. So when you get that, you'll take a moment to read it. If it's in alignment with what you believe and where you stand, then you'll take 3 minutes to send that email or pick up the phone and call your elected official. The gift that you give financially, once again, goes in its entirety to create sponsorships and scholarships for college students to go to our DC Summit and or go to our San Antonio Student Activism Leadership Training. So,
Thank you, Randy. So as we bring our time to a close this morning, I want to again thank you for being here. And I know that Elliot was not feeling that well when he came here today.
Feeling much better now with that.
Feeling much better today. Okay, good. Now, that coffee is what did it, wasn't
It certainly is.
Yeah, I told my daughter, I said, I want you to make Elliot the strongest coffee. And so, was it strong?
My toenails think so.
Your toenails think so. We like coffee in our home, and so we knew that Elliot would like it as well. Thank you for your patience being here today. Again, if you would like to give, or there's information here for you, both upstairs, downstairs, that's available for you as well. I want to just give them one more hand of appreciation being here this morning. Please close with a prayer. Father, we thank you for being a part of standing with Israel and hearing Elliot share today. Thank you for the wealth of information, the wisdom, and more than simply the information, but the heart that he shares it with. I pray, Father, as we look to the future, would you show us individually how you would call us to action, to stand, to participate, to be a part of your mandate, Lord, to stand with Israel found in your word. I pray, Lord, as we leave from here today, that we walk strong in your blessings, walk strong in your obedience, that we bring glory and honor to you in the days of our lives that you've given us to live here in this side of eternity. We pray these things in Jesus' strong name. And again, all of God's people said, Amen. Have a great afternoon downstairs. There's coffee and plenty of food for you as well.